born and raised in Skidmore, Missouri, Ken McElroy was a menace to his hometown for decades. From an early age, he exhibited aggressive behavior and disregard for the law. Over the years, Ken's behavior escalated, and he was involved in several violent incidents. Despite numerous complaints and calls for justice, the legal system failed to address Ken's criminal behavior adequately. When Ken was shot and killed by unknown townspeople, was his death a cold-blooded murder, an act of vigilantism, or justice? Ken Rex McElroy was born in 1934. He was the second youngest of the 16 children born to Tony and Mabel McElroy. Tony and Mabel, a poor farming couple, settled in Skidmore, Missouri. Growing up, Ken had a difficult childhood. As a young boy, he fell off of a hay wagon and hit his head, which experts believe may have contributed to the man he would eventually become. Head injuries can sometimes have a significant impact on a person's personality, leading to changes in behavior. In some cases, a typically happy, non-violent individual may transform into someone completely different. After the incident, doctors implanted a steel plate in his head. Despite his inability to read or write, Ken McElroy dropped out of school in the 8th grade at 15. Ken had no interest in learning, instead being drawn to a life of crime. The criminal side of the world appealed to him, and he started with minor offenses such as stealing and cattle rustling. Ken McElroy was suspected of involvement in various criminal activities for the next 20 years. He was believed to be involved in stealing grain, gasoline, livestock, alcohol, and antiques. However, even though everyone, including the police, knew Ken was responsible for the thefts in Skidmore, Ken managed to avoid prosecution 21 times. Despite overwhelming evidence and numerous witnessed accounts of Ken's involvement, he still managed to escape legal consequences on multiple occasions. One of the main reasons Ken avoided prosecution was the lack of cooperation from witnesses. In many cases, witnesses refused to testify against him, hindering the legal proceedings because Ken threatened or intimidated them. This tactic, known as witness tampering, involved Ken strategically parking his car outside the witnesses' homes, signaling his power and influence over them. Ken's actions were aimed at intimidating the witnesses into dropping their statements against him. By letting them know the potential consequences if they spoke out against him at trial, Ken sought to silence any possible witnesses who could expose his criminal activities. This intimidation aimed to create a sense of fear and coercion, discouraging the witnesses from coming forward and testifying. Although Ken presented himself to the world as a tough guy, the truth is that he never displayed any actual fighting skills. The only time anyone saw Ken throw a punch was at women. When Ken desired to engage in a physical altercation, he would always ensure he was armed. Ken preferred to bring a weapon to the fight, whether it was a gun or knife. Despite thinking he had power, Ken's actions reflected a lack of confidence in his abilities. As Ken McElroy grew, he garnered a reputation for himself as a womanizer. When Ken was a young man, he was undeniably handsome. His long, dark hair and sideburns drew comparisons to Elvis Presley. Ken's criminal activities granted him a flush of cash. With this newfound wealth, he embarked on a perilous journey, using it to lure women into his bed. However, as the 1970s unfolded, the glory days for Ken began to fade. Ken's once sharp features began to soften, and the weight of time began to take its toll. His once vibrant appearance began to dull, and the weight of his criminal activities started to manifest physically. Despite his physical appearance, Ken's crimes continued unabated. His once charming facade had transformed into a dangerous and manipulative force, leaving a trail of broken lives. Throughout his life, Ken had numerous lovers and fathered several children. Most of Ken's lovers were significantly younger than him. One of Ken's conquests, Trina McLeod, was only 12 years old at the time they met, and in the 8th grade. At the time Ken entered into a relationship with Trina, he was 35. When Trina was 14, she became pregnant with Ken McElroy's baby. Due to Trina's age, Ken faced charges of statutory sexual assault. However, Ken devised a plan to avoid being charged. He divorced his wife, Alice, and married Trina. This marriage served a strategic purpose. By marrying Trina, Ken ensured she could not be forced to testify against him. With Trina as his wife, Ken effectively shielded himself from the legal consequences that awaited him. Eventually, Trina gave birth to her and Ken's baby boy, but things took a turn for the worse after his birth. Feeling threatened by her husband's behavior, Trina decided to flee to her parents' house with the baby. Ken, driven by anger and a desire to regain control, followed Trina to her parents' house. Upon his arrival, Ken did something unimaginable. He set fire to the house, destroying it completely. In June 1973, he was arrested and booked on charges of arson, assault, and statutory sexual assault. Despite the seriousness of the allegations against him, Ken was released on bail while Trina and their infant son were put into the care of a foster home. Unfortunately, the situation did not improve. While out on bail, Ken managed to track down Trina and their baby boy. He positioned himself outside the foster home, where he issued chilling threats to the foster parents. Ken threatened to kidnap the foster parents' young biological child and trade her for Trina and his son. These threats not only frightened the foster parents but also led to additional charges being filed against Ken. In July 1976, a farmer from Skidmore alleged that Ken McElroy shot him, leading to a criminal complaint being filed against Ken. However, Ken denied shooting the farmer and insisted that he was elsewhere at the time of the incident. As the date for the trial approached, Ken took drastic measures to intimidate the farmer into dropping the charges. He parked his car outside the farmer's house, hoping to create a sense of fear and pressure. When Ken McElroy's trial began, 2 key witnesses were called to testify on his behalf. These 2 men were raccoon hunters, and they claimed that on the day the farmer was shot, Ken was with them, hunting far away. Their false testimony played a significant role in swaying the jury to acquit Ken. After the initial charge of shooting with intent to kill, Ken found himself facing another serious accusation. One of his children became involved in a verbal altercation with a clerk at a local store in Skidmore, allegedly after the child attempted to steal candy. Infuriated by the situation, Ken arrived at the store and confronted the store owner. In a heated argument, Ken brandished a shotgun and opened fire on the man, striking him in the neck. Miraculously, the victim survived the attack, but Ken was charged with attempted murder. Ken would tell anyone who would listen that the store owner approached him with a butcher knife, and he had no choice but to shoot the store owner in self-defense. However, no one believed Ken's version of events. Everyone knew the store owner was a harmless, docile man. Although the store owner admitted he was holding a knife when Ken shot him, he said it was because when Ken confronted him, he was in the middle of cutting up boxes. Residents of Skidmore were well familiar with Ken's violent behavior by that point, and no one took what he said as the truth. Yet no one let Ken know they felt that way, fearing how he would react. Eventually, Ken's case went to trial, and once again, his defense hinged on the testimony of witnesses. However, this time the outcome was different. The jury found Ken guilty and sentenced him to prison. Even though the jury convicted Ken of attempted murder, he was out on bail pending his appeal. While out on bond, residents of Skidmore actively avoided Ken. They lived in fear of Ken. Knowing anything he did that was in violation of the law was ignored by those in charge, as even the police were afraid of him. Residents of Skidmore were growing increasingly frustrated with the constant terrorizing they faced at the hands of Ken. As a result, they decided to gather at the American Legion Hall on July 10, 1981, to hold a meeting with the county sheriff in order to discuss how they could protect themselves. The residents' fears were heightened by the fact that earlier that day, Ken had shown up at the D&G Tavern armed with a rifle. Ken was there to threaten anyone who had witnessed the shooting of the shop owner. After the meeting at the Legion Hall, the Skidmore residents returned to the D&G Tavern. Ken McElroy, who was at the bar with his underage bride Trina, decided to purchase a 6-pack of beer. As the night progressed, Ken left the bar and returned to his pickup truck. With his new supply of alcohol in hand, Ken sat down and began drinking his beers. While Ken sat in the pickup truck, there was a sudden burst of gunfire. Nearly 50 people, including Ken's wife Trina, were eyewitnesses to the shocking scene. The shots were fired from 2 different weapons, a centerfire rifle and a .22 rimfire rifle. Despite the presence of so many witnesses, not one of them made any attempt to call for medical assistance. Ken succumbed to his injuries at the scene. An investigation was launched into Ken's death despite the prevailing sentiment against him in the town. The detectives concluded that there were two shooters, one of whom was positioned behind Ken's pickup truck, and the other was estimated to be at least half a block away. Despite the presence of 50 individuals outside D&G Tavern at the time of the shooting, the witnesses interviewed by the detectives maintained that they did not see who shot Ken. Ken's underage bride, Trina, was questioned by the detectives, and she alleged that a man named Del Clement was responsible for Ken's death. However, no charges were ever filed against anyone in relation to Ken's death. Ultimately, the crime was categorized as a murder committed by an unknown person or persons. Residents of Skidmore did not mourn Ken McElroy, but instead celebrated their newfound freedom from his reign of terror. After 30 years of torment, the community rejoiced at the news of his death. The postmaster in Skidmore said Ken McElroy's shooters should get a medal instead of facing prison time. Ken McElroy was laid to rest at Memorial Park Cemetery in St. Joseph, Missouri, on July 9, 1984. Years later, Trina, Ken's widow, filed a $5 million wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Skidmore, the county sheriff and mayor. She also named Del Clement as a defendant, claiming that he had killed Ken. However, the case was settled out of court. Trina received $17,600 as compensation, but no party admitted guilt. Eventually, Trina remarried and left Skidmore. However, her new life was cut short as she passed away on her 55th birthday in January 2012, succumbing to cancer. Despite numerous investigations and speculation into Ken's death, the identity of his shooters remains elusive. Many residents in Skidmore believe that unless someone confesses to the crime on their deathbed, Ken's unsolved murder will forever remain a mystery. They know that there are undoubtedly people within the community who have knowledge of the shooters, but have chosen to stay silent. Some believe that Ken's death was an act of cold-blooded murder perpetrated by individuals who had lost all sense of justice. They argue that taking the law into one's own hands is never the answer, and that the legal system should be trusted to handle such matters. On the other hand, there are those who believe that Ken McElroy's death was a form of vigilante justice. These people argue that after years of suffering at the hands of this criminal, the community took matters into their own hands to restore order and safety. Many residents view Ken's murder as something that brought relief to a community plagued by Ken's reign of terror. The story of Ken McElroy, the menace of Skidmore, Missouri, is complex and multifaceted. The circumstances leading to his death raise questions about the nature of justice, vigilantism, and the value of human life. Ultimately, the truth lies somewhere in between, as the actions taken by those who confronted Ken were driven by fear, desperation, and a desire for a safer community. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? Subscribe now for updates. Can't wait for more. Click the link above to learn about the horrific murder of a family taken at the hands of a child in The Deadly Retreat. Stay curious, stay connected, stay with Reely Unreal.